Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for this very extensive and interesting presentation. And what I have prepared for you is the speech, the presentation concerning the various methods for documenting used in by the Auschwitz Museum. So today I'm going to discuss how we document our conservation works, why we do that, and what techniques we use. Our works of conservators is usually invisible, but what is visible
zabytki.
are their effects. That is the historic objects that we make available for you. But what's going on during conservation works? Whoever is interested, please have a quick view of history, the history of documentation. Also, the history of documentation starts somewhere, and it started a very long time ago, before the laser scanner or the cameras were invented. Various artists documented either antique, ancient buildings or contemporary ones, and it all started with a very interesting invention that is camera obscura, that is the dark room. It is the great grandfather of a camera. This exceptional invention kept evolving in a form of a portable device which made it possible for many painters, and the most famous of them was Vermeer and Canaletto. And thanks to this invention, artists could document buildings with a very precise accuracy to show the perspective and to show the relationship of the sizes and the relationships between objects. And thanks to that, we have great and accurate views of non-existing city centers. But history of technology brought us something different. That is a camera. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, the most popular device that is used for documentation. It is the device, the invention that completely revolutionized the history of documentation and reporting. And uh, thanks to photography, which is almost 180 years old, we have the ability to document the views, to show the reality in an objective method. So, like Vermeer or Canaletto were showing the reality with an artistic creation, the photo camera allowed for something completely new, that is the objective vision of reality. And have a look. Uh, uh, this is our history, which transfers into present times. We have the photographs, the camera, which is an indispensable device. So, how it is applied in the documentation of historic objects, and what is its standard? What is the good practice of documenting the historic objects? So, first of all, as it was mentioned, every historic object needs to be documented in the following way. The first stage comprises the photographs of the building in this state as it was preserved. That is before the conservation work started. Then we show the entire progress of conservation, and this is all the more interesting because we can show the entire workshop, the tools, the facilities, and people at work. And at the end of each documentation, we have the completion documentation of the entire historic object after the process of conservation. So this is an absolute minimum, photographs before, during and after. But as it was mentioned before, in the museum, we have 150 buildings, more than 300 ruins of various types of relics. And what is also important is the scale of the area. As you saw previously, the size of the area of the object, I can show to you the actual size of the territory. Well, what it
Rynku Krakowa.
can be compared to. So it can be compared to the main market square in Krakow, which is 4 hectares, and our museum is 191 hectares, which is 50 times larger than the main market square in Krakow. And it is by all means a great challenge to organize everything not to get lost, and find our way once we continue works with historic objects. Apart from the size of the territory, it is its diversity, because the collections are really different from each other, and they are very smaller, larger sizes and volumes of the buildings, plus the infrastructure that was mentioned before. And once you have so many objects, the museum faces an immense challenge. That is how, in an organized and good way, to document the conservation works. Myself, as a conservator, I ask a question: how to preserve and how to conserve information about the works that have been conducted. And I would like to communicate to future conservators, to my successors, in a complete and exhaustive way, what was going on with a historic object and how all the works were going on, so that the next conservators could continue our mission. And that is why, what challenges we have.
Well, I've presented the challenges, but what solutions can we propose? Well, for the needs of our museum, we showed simply the concept of documentation, and now I'll present to you its key assumptions. The first and foremost is a perfect quality of the image, its legibility, and its very high resolution. Then we need to define the location where that is. We must also remember about the people who will use this documentation. So it needs to be very easy to use, be it through a mobile app, and this is a photograph of the floor tiling to be reset. These solutions show different developments, and these were incorporated into our portfolio of tools. Absolutely fundamental is digital photography. Additionally, this is with white balance, open air photography, documenting the conservation works, and the development of it is panoramic photography, which makes it possible for us to show greater amounts of space. Then comes photogrammetry. We can see here precise shapes, and something that is not that obvious and that's not used in most museums, is a film. Everyone who has a mobile can make one, and we decided to complement it, to provide a film in it. Now, let's go to Egypt. More than 50 years ago, the absolutely unique and uncanny operation of transfer of an Egyptian shrine, and it was transferred so as not to have it inundated when a dam was built. You'll see the tools used, the technologies, the means employed to achieve it. And that really inspired us to make films in our museum. Then somebody will see it, but things will happen easier for them, and I hope easier also to uh, understand. We record these videos accompany our documentation works. They mean making photographs, and they are a perfect complementation. In seconds. They can answer many questions, and we could have more questions. And in dozens of years, perhaps those films will answer them for the coming generations. So films are highly educational. They show numerous stages of work of a conservation officer in the studio, engineering, construction works, perfect complementation of everything that documentation gives you. And then the previous speaker really exhausted this subject, and let me now complement it with a new method of generating 3D models without a scanner, only with a collection of photos. This is a model made from 100 photographs. That's the place where they washed in one of the barracks. They are not that precise. However, this is one of the tools that will certainly be developing and then will be as perfect as the laser measurements. At the end, something that's perhaps the most interesting documentation that a museum can show to people, that's documentation in the form of a virtual browser of the objects. You definitely know it from Google Maps. Obviously, due to the type of documentation and the place, we made it in a much higher resolution, much greater precision as well. Thanks to this tool, we can move around the sites we have, and we can move to different dates. As I said in the beginning, it's absolutely necessary to show the sites before, during, and after conservation. We also make sure that they have this virtual browser for those stages. Thanks to this, we can compare the view, how it's changed, and what it looks like now after conservation. It's used in everyday life by our teams, craftsmen, conservation experts. That's a tale for the future conservation experts, which showed perfectly what's happened to the piece of art. It also shows what it means to be authentic in practice. With that, I'd like to continue. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my team for completing these projects. Thank you for this work. Thank you for documentation of that unbelievably important heritage. Thank you very much for the time and see you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if you can hear me. You can? Good. In my presentation, I'll try to speak of maintenance and preservation of the greenery, the high-standing greenery in Auschwitz-Birkenau. First, numbers. We care for more than 200 hectares. It's nearly 24 hectares, and we have 178 altogether, of which are 5.5 hectare forested in Oświęcim and 47.6 in Brzezinka-Birkenau. Trees in numbers. In Auschwitz, we have 678 inventoried and signed trees. In Brzezinka, over 16,000. Stock taken and marked. Priorities for us in maintenance of greenery, we focus on the high-standing greenery. First, it's to preserve those that connect us to history. Accounts of the witnesses make it possible to define the historical tree stands. These are the trees that were growing in the camp when it was still in operation. The greenery we call historical today was intended partially. This landscape was adapted partially. It was introduced with specific functions. We singled out three functions: the cover function masking cripes, and then this is the first one. It masked the facilities for mass murder. The first gas chambers and also the pyres were in the pine forests, now illusory. So tree alleys and then flower pots, all those were elements of the landscape to provide a positive image on the Red Cross and other international commissions. We also have accompanying functions, witnesses of the events. These included the birch alleys, all the other alleys, plus individual trees and the characteristic birch tree by the Arbeit Gate, as well as oaks and many other trees that many others find quite a regular element that belongs to the landscape. Dealing with the trees, we find that the trees are witnesses of events. These are living organisms that undergo continuous change, and it's impossible to keep them in unchanged version. We want to retain the most important elements of those tree stands, for example, the birch by the Arbeit Gate, also some greenery that becomes part of a landscape in Brzezinka. Here we have several photos in the birch alley on the left when the camp was working. It's several years old now due to winds. We see it's deteriorated so much that it's now not accessible for the visitors. We want these to continue in the space so that they don't threaten the visitors. I said that trees have their lifespan and there are problems of re-establishment. Poplars are short-lived. That's why poplar alleys were first to be exchanged. In several years, poplars are replanted. That's the part of the basic care on the tree stand here. We can see here the historic tree stand, which did not allow safe continuation in space. Exchange of poplar tree stands or tree canopies are here. The first of the projects has already been completed. Italian poplars were exchanged in 2009-2012 in stages. The ones we see here were planted 2009-2012, then they were 3 to 4 meters tall, and we can see them in May this year. So the effect is visible. The second completed project are the poplars around Brzezinka, conducted from 18 to 20. This is a fragment of the project, and this is information about the condition of the trees. They simply could not function in the museum. They were replaced by the new stands. We can see here some poplars immediately after being planted. The following are in Brzezinka just after planting. That's the condition as of today. A large share of our activity is collection of information that allows monitoring. The range of activities that we undertake to create this database include inventory, stock taking. Each tree has an individual number. There are arboristic nails on the old trees. Young trees, as you can see on the left, they are loosely hung on the trees so as not to damage the tree. The tree number is connected to a point on a map, and it has a special corresponding number in the database. There are parameters of the tree and all the other information. This is an excerpt from a map from our map. We use green spaces, and each city has its individual information. Archive materials are here, plus information for specific trees. Thanks to the database, we have information about historical and non-historical trees. We can say that these trees definitely grew here when the camp functioned. This is done from earlier stock takings. Another way of differentiating the age of trees are studies conducted on the premises. Basic dendrometric information allows expanding the database with more information. Basic evaluation of the trees, finding the ones that need an extensive diagnosis, and Watching those, we look at the canopy, amount of dry leaves dropped, and also we look at fungi changes on the trunks. Everything is, of course, adjusted with the potential threats that a tree can form. Specialist assessment is regularly made according to suggestions or when we see that the condition of the tree is deteriorating. It all depends on the risk, intensity of use of the land around the tree, and also the buildings that the tree can threaten. Also, sound tomography and other studies are conducted by dendrologists. Everything that goes beyond the basic observation is consulted with our conservation expert. In the center, we see the tree in its intersection. It's after sound tomography. It shows the thickness of the tree inside and shows the areas of worst damage and lesser density of a tree. It tells us whether a tree is stable or whether we have major doubts about that. This is information about the condition of a tree plus also information about the actions to be taken. Why evaluation of trees is so important? Under this tree, for example, in August 2019, there were 12,697 people passing. Average number of persons here, about 3,700. That makes an impact. Regular control and diagnostic of this makes it possible to keep this tree at a high level. The greater the number of visitors, the more important that is. Statistically, trees that pose worst risk are those near the pedestrian passages, ruins. Lesser risk is in the case of those that grow further from those that stand somewhere solitarily in distance. Trees, when undergo regular diagnostics, they allow limiting the risk for people who stay near. You will see what we do with trees. There are regular reviews and current care. That's to provide basic safety. Dead branches are removed. The canopy is tested. If there are some ties within it, then their condition is checked. Wherever possible, it's done from a ladder. If this is impossible, then arborists will do it with their specialist equipment. Here we have a tree that underwent such practices. Here we have a tree that's been cleaned. All the dry, dead branches have been removed. Dead wood, dry wood is removed as well as dead tops. Here we can see works and controls done with a ladder. Here in the crown, we can see an arborist who cleans an oak, and here we have arboristic works conducted in the canopy. We have now here some dry twigs removed.
The works are performed at different times of year depending on the need. We sometimes do not have any influence on the conditions So sometimes the work is really hard and requires a lot of skills and qualifications. Another element of the trees conservation is the some bindings in the crowns of the trees, which is a protection against uncontrolled fall of a tree, which sometimes happens when the winds are strong. So this is a tree protected with a binding element, and these bindings protected a significant twig against falling. So these binding strips give some times and space for any safe, protective, and maintenance actions. Such protections in the crowns of the trees are regularly supervised, and the necessity of implementing them is consulted with specialists. In the current maintenance work related to the maintenance of the trees, the museum is supported by the voluntary work. So there is a voluntary group of the forest specialists, especially in the actions related to the maintenance of the existing trees. To sum up, in spite of a very mature and old trees, which are undergoing slow and gradual changes, we want the eldest witnesses to the history of the place existed in the way that does not pose any danger or threat to the visitors. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for all the presentations, and they brought a lot of interesting information, showed a lot of interesting facts. And as we heard, the areas of the former concentration camp are under conservation, and with the also infrastructure and fences,
oraz magazynach
but
tysiące poobozowych
conservation also pertains to thousands of documents and camp objects. As Director Furo mentioned, this year we plan 2 more sessions which will be devoted to the subject. One of them about the conservation of archival materials and the other about the conservation of collections. This session is drawing to an end. I would like to thank the speakers and everybody who was connected and followed us online. Please follow our website and take part in our next sessions. See you next time.